Hey, Jeff Nelson of VegSource, and it is my pleasure today to welcome our guest, the inimitable Dr. Peter Rogers. Dr. Rogers is our resident genius. He's been gracing us about once a month with his insights on various interesting topics. In case you don't know who Dr. Rogers is, he went to Stanford, which is my alma mater too. He went to Harvard Medical School. He graduated at the top of his class of 333 students. He's currently engaged in full-time medical practice. But when he's not at work or treating patients, Dr. Rogers runs a bustling YouTube channel where he consistently delivers fascinating content. But wait, there's more. Dr. Rogers is also a prolific author. He's currently publishing what looks like an astonishing rate to me of like one book per month. This is his page on Amazon. And let me tell you, these aren't just any books. They're information-packed, high-quality works that truly deliver value. And speaking of books, today's talk by Dr. Rogers is called The Top 50 Books in Health and Nutrition. And it's also the title of a new book that he has out. I don't have his latest book yet. This is what it looks like on Amazon. But I'm looking forward to the talk. And I want to mention that Dr. Rogers recently wrote a book called what's it called? John McDougall, the doctor who fought for you, the greatest doctor who ever lived. And he dedicated the book to John and Mary McDougall. And I think it's a beautiful dedication. I've got my copy of the book right here. And I want to just read what he wrote here. It's he said, to John and Mary McDougall, this is the dedication of this new book. He said, your unwavering dedication to truth in nutrition and health has illuminated the path for countless individuals, including myself. John, your tireless efforts to educate and empower patients have inspired generations of health-conscious individuals and medical professionals alike. Mary, your steadfast support and culinary wisdom have made the journey to health not just possible, but delicious. This book is dedicated to you both in gratitude for the lives you've changed, the truths you've championed, and the legacy of health you've created. Your work continues to ripple through time, touching lives and transforming health. May this compilation serve as a testament to your enduring impact on human health and happiness. With deepest respect and appreciation, Peter Rogers, MD. And I think that's really nice what he says there. And what Dr. Rogers did in this book, he went through and he's read every book written by Dr. McDougall, every newsletter article, pretty much every video that's on McDougall's YouTube channel. He went through drmcdougall.com, the website, and he combed through this wealth of information that Dr. McDougall produced over his lifetime. And he carefully curated a collection. That's alliteration. He carefully curated a collection of Dr. McDougall's best insights, quotes, ideas, and views, his views on the impact of Dr. McDougall on the world, and he organized it in a way that makes them accessible and applicable. Now, something interesting is that I made a video review of the book that I put on my channel. And when I was posting links to my review in some of the McDougall forums that I participate in, a few people were questioning Dr. Rogers' motives in writing this book. And they were saying, do the McDougalls approve of this book? Did he, why did he write this book? Why wouldn't you just read all of McDougall's books yourself in his videos and his website and in his newsletter? Why would you pay money to Peter Rogers for a book that Dr. Rogers is trying to capitalize off Dr. McDougall? So someone really said that. It was sort of conspiratorial and bizarre. And I realize some people may react to Dr. Rogers' penchant for discussing his views on religion at times, and some people, might be put off by that, but there's none of that in this book. But it made me think that I read a book called Einstein, His Life and Universe by a well-known biographer and professor, a guy named Walter Isaacson. And in this biography, Eisen examines Einstein's scientific contributions. He goes through and comments on, the various theories and the ideas that Einstein developed over his life. And he not only recounts his life, but he evaluates the impact and the significance of his scientific work in the broader context of physics and intellectual history. Now, I don't know anyone who is accusing Walter Isaacson of, capitalizing off Einstein by writing a book about Einstein's life and contributions. And I hope, for one, that many more vegan doctors and regular doctors and writers and will do what Dr. Rogers has done and will write a book about Dr. John McDougall and try to assess and spotlight and amplify Dr. McDougall's contributions. Dr. Rogers' ability to consume a large amount of content and then summarize and analyze and synthesize a fascinating work out of that is really quite impressive. And he can do it so quickly. So I'm envious. But anyhow, my take is that the more people talking about and writing about Dr. McDougall out there, the better. And that also means that, more people might then find out about Dr. McDougall's online program, which his family and team continue to offer, and that helps countless people improve their well-being. Okay, that was my comment that I wanted to make. So welcome, Dr. Rogers. Whoops, it's great to have you back.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, also, as far as there's no money in books, okay? I'll make more money in one day. I'll make more money in half a day than I make for any stupid book. It's just something I do because it's right. And also, there's a question of Dr. McDougall is the greatest doctor in the world. I want to be the greatest doctor in the world. In order to become the greatest doctor in the world, I have to know what he did. So I went through all of his stuff because I want to learn from him. And that's what I did. And you sort of absorb all the knowledge from the ones that have gone before you, and then you try to add to it. That's how you become really good at something.
Yeah, no question. You've done a superb job. I just had to mention that because, as I say, a couple of people, it's the internet, so what do you expect? But
yeah, no matter what you do, somebody can be upset. And the other thing, too, is, there's also a tremendous effort, I believe, to suppress the work of Dr. McDougall. I think they want him shoved into a corner. Him, Kempner, all these low-fat guys. There's the pushes for this moderate to high-fat stuff, which allows you to sell a lot of things. There's no money in the low-fat vegan diet. There's no money in low-fat vegan patients. I'm 60 years old. I don't have any medical problems. I don't take any pills. If everybody went low-fat vegan, the whole healthcare system would go broke. But the reality is, less than 1 in 10,000 patients will consider it. Every day in the Western hospitals, there's a river of all these fat, diabetic, hypertensive, atherosclerotic patients flooding in to get their colonoscopies, their CAT scans, their blood tests. Everybody was happy to do all that stuff. I'm doing something proactive for my health, but none of them wants to go low-fat vegan. So it's kind of just a big joke.
Yeah. No, you're preaching to the choir here. Absolutely agree. Well, listen, are you ready to tell us about the 50 top books in nutrition and health? And I hope at least one of your books made your own list. I always like the title of this one, How to Fix Your Fat Ass in 5 Easy Steps. But anyhow, all right, let's get going, shall we?
Okay. Yeah, here I got the talk.
Great.
Okay, so here it is. Here's the first slide. Here's the top 50 books of all time. You can screen print that one if you want. Okay, the first book we start. Well, first of all, just a little metaphor. Like I said, in the Western hospitals, there's like this pilgrimage of people to the hospital thinking that it's the cathedral of science and they're going to the best place. And it reminds me, too, this idea of like a pilgrimage. Here's the famous pilgrimage from France to San Juan de Compostela, the big cathedral in Spain. And, here's like Canterbury was a famous pilgrimage. That first painting was a pilgrimage of Canterbury Tales. And I'm thinking we ought to maybe have something like Westminster Abbey, like a big museum for the low-fat vegans. We could have statues of McDougall and some of the other great ones in there. What I'm trying to say is the modern people, they think science has replaced religion and science is truth. What they don't understand is about 99% of what people think science is just the emperor's new clothes, okay? In the old days, with primitive technology, they could build cathedrals. Nowadays, a typical modern building, according to Tom Wolfe, the American writer, is all modern buildings look like animal cages, and there's always a statue of a turd in front. In the art museums, they put statues of turds. So what I'm trying to say is modernism, this sort of atheistic Darwinism society, people think things have improved, and they have not, okay? And I want to make a point to you. Be careful. You can get useful information from the medical system, but don't think it's all going to be good. Don't think that who your brother really loves you that much, okay? And what I'm trying to say is we've forgotten a lot of the basics. The reason the mother and the father are the two best people in the world for a baby is because they love that baby. And you need to have some of this love and community stuff to end up doing well. And all this technology is overrated. Humans were not made for high tech, to have artificial intelligence to tell us what to eat for breakfast. We're made to live more like Adam and Eve. Keep it simple, but it's nice to have indoor heating and plumbing, okay? We're made to have conversations like this, okay? We're not made to Okay, artificial intelligence, when that gets into medicine, you know exactly what it's going to do. It's going to tell you take more drugs. So if you're lucky, this is how the typical person ends up, just being a chump, milked every day for their money to take a bunch of pills. But it's even worse than that. Here's Pinocchio when he sort of went along with the common group of boys and behaved stupidly. He got turned into a donkey, and then he got used in the circus, the operating theater, for unnecessary operations, and it could be a lot worse. So anyways, getting to the books, I would say starting with number one, Starch Solution by Dr. McDougall. It's his best book, and it teaches you what you need to know to be healthy. And like he tells the person, if you can't make up your mind what to do, where to start, he says, just eat 90% of your calories from starch, 5% from fruits and vegetables, and you will be on your way to good health. And you can learn everything else as you go along. And I would agree with that. I've been a doctor over 30 years. The most important thing I ever learned in all of this stuff is humans should eat a starch-based diet. And, you go to the zoo, the zookeeper knows what to feed the animal. But you go to a human doctor, they don't know what to feed a person. Okay, like say 1 out of about 10,000 doctors knows nutrition. And it's pretty simple. It's a polymer. Starch is a polymer of glucose wrapped in fiber. It's low caloric density, so it stretches the stomach, and by stretching the stomach, you get early satisfaction of hunger. It then travels through the intestine, takes time for the intestinal enzymes to peel the fiber off the glucose, so it creates the effect of a slow-release energy pill, and your blood glucose level stays relatively normal for a prolonged amount of time. With the net result, you satisfy hunger with the fewest number of calories. It keeps you healthy. If you eat something too sweet, like a pure sugar drink, so to speak, there's a tendency to rebound hypoglycemia. Then you feel lousy in the hypoglycemic component of the phase. So you eat more and you end up with a roller coaster blood glucose curve, and you have a tendency to get fat. If you eat fat, you cause insulin resistance. If you eat protein, you get a hypercholesterolemia as well. Okay, we're not going to go into all of that, but you want to go down the starch path. This is just McDougall's other great book. He's written a bunch of really good books, but I'd say these are his two best. Digestive Tune-Up is just from your mouth to your butt, all the diseases and the relationship of food to disease. For the questions that he doesn't cover, I've included an honorable mention book by Bolshevitz, Fiber Fueled. This is a good book. Whenever there's a disagreement, I would take what McDougall says over Bolshevitz. He's got a lot more experience than Bolshevitz. But Bolshevitz is a smart guy, and he has some good points, and he fills in some of the gaps for those types of issues. This is the book I wrote about Dr. McDougall. Dr. McDougall, the doctor who fought for you, the best doctor that ever lived. I say the best doctor who ever lived because he cured more patients than anyone else. Kempner treated about 19,000 patients in his clinic with fantastic results. McDougall only treated 12,000 in his clinic, but, he treated so many more, including his books and including his telehealth clinic and his internet videos. So he deservedly gets the nod on that one. One of his great mentors was Burkitt. So this is book number 4. And the best book of Burkitt, my favorite one, was Ethel Nelson's biography of him. Talks all about his time working as, he's an Irish surgeon, and he's working as a Christian missionary in Africa. And he discovered the pattern of inheritance for a disease called Burkitt's lymphoma. And that's named after him. That's the only thing medical people will know about Burkitt. But then he figured out abdominal pressure syndrome, which was an incredible finding. Basically, when you have dry stool, see, fiber from plants, and there's only fiber in plants. There's no fiber in meat. It causes water to come into the stool. So you'll have liquid stool on the right side of the colon. And when you defecate, it's going to be like a cow patty. That's what it should be like, okay? And that's a nice bowel movement, okay? If you don't eat the fiber, then the stool's quite dried out by the time it reaches the rectum. You're defecating with goat pellets, okay, or little hard Tootsie Rolls. And that creates straining because normally you defecate because the bulky stool stretches the rectum and it causes a reflex contraction to empty the rectum. When your stool pellets are small, goat pellets, and dried out, you don't stretch the rectum adequately and you get incomplete emptying. That's why they'll feel like they still have to go more. They'll strain their abdominal muscles. That's called a Valsalva maneuver to defecate. And then that back pressure is transmitted to the sigmoid colon, causing diverticuli, outpouchings between the muscular layers of the sigmoid colon, and those can sometimes pop, and that's diverticulitis. The back pressure is transmitted up to the stomach, and it gradually works a widening of the hiatus for the esophagus in the diaphragm, and the stomach starts to pop into the chest. That's called hiatal hernia through the hiatus, and you'll reflux gastric acid into that component that's up in the chest. That causes a heartburn-like sensation. It's called GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. Over time, it changes the lining to be a Barrett's metaplasia, and then it predisposes to esophageal cancer. Anyways, because the stool's dried out on the right side, you're predisposed to appendicitis because you form little rocks of stool called appendicolith Lift means stone in the appendix. The mucous glands below keep secreting. They can't get past the obstructing stone, so it pops. That's appendicitis. Back pressure transmitted into the legs, varicose veins, transmitted into the scrotum. Varicocele can cause infertility, hemorrhoids, rectal hemorrhoids. But yeah, being constipated could make a guy infertile. Okay, so that's some of the Dennis Burkitt great stuff. And he was the first mentor that taught McDougall that diet was related to disease. And then along came Nathan Pritikin. And Nathan Pritikin wrote two excellent books. You know, Nathan Pritikin's a very clear, precise writer. And he said some very useful things. Nathan Pritikin said, there is no such thing as a diet that is too low in fat. He also said there's no such thing as a naturally chosen diet that is too low in protein. And he went through studies where people were eating less than 1% of their calories from fat, and they were doing just fine. Okay, the other thing is Nathan Pritikin wrote a legacy book, and it's only available at Dr. McDougall's website, drmcdougall.com. It's an excellent book. He reviewed all the medical literature. It, elaborates on his theory of lipotoxicity. Pritikin said a lot of funny stuff. Pritikin said basically all Americans are diabetic after dinner because they eat a high-fat dinner, and the high-fat meal induces insulin resistance. He says the reason they don't all test as diabetic in the morning is because you keep them NPO overnight, nothing per hour, nothing by mouth. And then when they're fasted, they'll have better performance on the oral glucose tolerance test. Okay, here's book number 6. This is Walter Kempner. He's a great genius who figured out the rice diet in Durham, North Carolina. And, he saw how skinny and healthy all these Asian people were. And he also had the background of being working in nephrology with the kidney patients. So he started out mostly treating hypertension and kidney failure, and his patients also had tremendous weight loss, and all these fat people would sort of migrate over there, take a pilgrimage to Duke University, and he kept the place busy. He was like the main draw for the entire hospital for many, many years. This is a real funny book called Fat Like Us by Jean Anspaugh. She was a patient who went there. She got a lot of funny quotes about there's a lot of funny stuff in that book, all the lingo that was associated with the fat people migrating to Durham, North Carolina. This book was written by Barbara Newborg, and this is the one that's really the number 6. And it goes through a lot of personal stuff in there. She chats a lot. She was friends with him, and she was a doctor who worked with him. But she goes through all his medical stuff, too, with a lot of pictures and discussion of how he was reversing hypertensive retinopathy, diabetic retinopathy. Here's the patients, they would all weigh in the rice houses publicly. So everyone would then eat their meals together and talk to each other. People who lost over 100 pounds, their names up on the wall. Dr. Kempner's book is also available for free at Dr. McDougall's website, drmcdougall.com. And Dr. McDougall said, don't even challenge me, you young whippersnappers, with your ideas about nutrition until you have read Pritikin and you have read Kempner. If you haven't read Pritikin and Kempner, you really are not entitled to a conversation about nutrition in any type of serious way. And I would agree that you have to kind of know this to know what's out there. And once you read this, and you should know Burkitt too, then you've got a foundation for everything else that comes after it. Okay, here's Dr. McDougall talking about what was involved in the Pritikin diet. 2%, this is the rice diet of Kempner. 2% of calories from fat. Look at that, 2%. That's an incredibly low amount of fat. 4% of protein. That's an incredibly low amount of protein. If you just eat a routine plant-based diet without thinking about it too much, relatively low in fat, you'll probably come out about 80-10-10. But what he was saying here is that by dropping the protein down to 4%, what Kempner was doing is protecting the kidneys. The main job of the kidney is to excrete nitrogen. There's only nitrogen in protein. There's no nitrogen in fat. There's no nitrogen in carbohydrates. So by dropping the workload for the kidneys, those kidney failure patients were able to live a lot longer and, under much better health. He also really minimized dietary sodium. That's a topic for another day. One interesting point is 100% of his type 2 diabetics were cured. So type 2 diabetes is totally curable. You reduce dietary fat. Dietary fat's the main cause of insulin resistance. So that's not widely known. You could talk to people who are fellowship trained in endocrinology, specialize in diabetes, and they don't know this. You would be amazed at how little doctors read. They typically only read their textbook, which is what they have to study to prepare for their boards exam, and they really know very little beyond that. They'll get some clinical experience, but if everything tells them, the wrong thing, then they don't know any better. Okay, book number 7. This is Blood Viscosity. Its role in cardiovascular pathophysiology and hematology. The author is Gregory Sloop, MD. He's a pathologist. This is a brilliant guy. This is the best book ever written on atherosclerosis. You know, I had been interested in atherosclerosis when I was a young guy. I did a fellowship in imaging-guided surgery called interventional radiology. Did lots and lots of lower extremity, pelvis, balloon angioplasty, stenting, thrombolysis, all of that sort of stuff, atherectomies, you name it. And I used to think that we were the atherosclerosis doctors, the cardiologists, the imaging-guided surgeons, the vascular surgeons, and the cardiothoracic surgeons. We're the ones that really know atherosclerosis. But what I later realized is we're just a bunch of plumbers, okay? We're just trying to bypass a blockage. We don't really think about the disease intrinsically. It was the guys like Sloot. He looks at it under a microscope because he's a pathologist. Also, because he's a pathologist, he's got no dog in the fight. He doesn't care how you treat atherosclerosis. He just looks at it under a microscope and he says, guess what? Atherosclerosis, it's a blood clot. And now that I've looked at a lot of atherosclerosis with CT angiograms, CTAs, it's a blood clot. You can't tell it apart from a blood clot because it is a blood clot, okay? And then it becomes organized over time. It eventually will calcify quite often, for example. And he brought forward the concept of bridging molecules. Bridging molecules are things that stick red blood cells together. And when they stick the red blood cells together, it's called beginning to aggregate. Blood is thixotropic. It's not a Newtonian fluid, meaning that if you let it just sit there in a cup, it doesn't remain unchanged. It will clot. And I think that's also what happens when you go on a long car ride or a long flight for a couple hours. And when you first get out, everything is kind of awkward. It's not working too well because you got to let the blood sort of free up so it can perfuse things and start delivering oxygen more effectively. Elevated LDL cholesterol sticks red blood cells together. So it increases blood viscosity, blood thickness. Fibrinogen, the clotting protein, does that. It turns out LPS, you know, from gram-negative bacteria, the endotoxin, and LTA from gram-positive bacteria will also have the same effect. Okay, and even overload with iron. A lot of people are iron overloaded from dietary iron excesses. They'll trend into something called amyloidogenic clotting. I'll come back to that later, but I'm just telling you, if you want to study atherosclerosis, I was very interested in atherosclerosis for decades. This is the best book. I've read everything, okay, and that I could. And I actually ended up talking to him. And I'm telling you, they don't care. He doesn't care if you treat it with a pill, with a stent, with a surgery. Okay, here's another fantastic book. This is called High Blood Pressure Solution. The name of the author is Richard Moore, MD, PhD. He researched these ion pumps and plasma membranes for like 45 years, his entire adult career. You know, he's got papers from back in like the 1950s, and it's a fantastic book. Once you understand that the sodium-potassium ATP pump in the plasma membrane of every cell in the human body is used to generate the equivalent of an electrical battery, okay? You separate charge across a membrane, you got a charge differential, and you got a current because you have flowing ions that are charged. This enables the cell to do work. And when you eat the normal diet for humans, which is high in potassium, P for plant, P for potassium, and low in sodium, you run this battery effectively, and the cell can do what it needs to do. When you start eating a westernized diet high in sodium, you dissipate these gradients, and it makes the cell less able to function, and it also causes hypertension. He actually called the ratio of potassium to sodium the K factor, and he said you always want, at a minimum, to be at least 5 times higher in potassium than sodium. I would say you probably want to be about 10 times higher, but if you're at least 5 times higher, you'll be okay. Whereas typical Americans eating, you know, like about 10 to 1 sodium to potassium, and it's messing them up. That's why so many people are hypertensive. And hypertension is the most common risk factor for stroke, so it's not a good thing, and cognitive impairment. Okay, here's how it looks, a little bit more complex. So here's the sodium-potassium ATP pump. You generate an electrical gradient, typically about negative 65 millivolts in a brain cell and neuron. You also have a chemical gradient. The sodium concentration typically is about 10 times higher extracellular compared to intracellular. And this gradient now, both of a chemical gradient and an electrical gradient, because it's positively charged sodium, it wants to come into the cell to move towards a negative charge. That is coupled to pumping calcium out of the cell. And you always need some type of, initially an ATP investment to pump calcium out because its gradient is 15,000 times higher outside the cell than inside the cell. Calcium is like the aristocrat of ions. It comes in and says, do this, do this, do this, versus sodium, potassium, magnesium. They're like the manual labor, minimum wage workers, okay? So everything is all based on how do we adjust the calcium concentration in the cytoplasm, because that determines what happens in a cell. All right, the book number 9 is the Caldwell-Esselstyn Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease. It's a magnificent achievement. You know, he deserves a Nobel Prize. They'll never give him a Nobel Prize. They don't want the public to know about it. That would generate too much publicity. They will not allow that to happen. Here's like his definitive paper in the July 2014 of Family Practice Journal, where he talks about, is there a way to reverse coronary artery disease? And he followed a bunch of patients for a long time, going back to around 1985. And he initially published smaller studies, then bigger studies. And it was sort of like 177 patients with about a 99.4% no recurrent cardiovascular events. And you could show some reversal of the coronary artery disease on SPECT scans. It fills in instead of being green here, it's yellow here, perfusing better. Here's one patient in particular. This was a surgeon who followed his diet very meticulously. And here he has a relatively severe long segment ratty stenosis in like his left anterior descending coronary artery, and it completely resolved. So you can reabsorb the lipid core of an atherosclerotic plaque. You can reabsorb the necrotic core. You can partially reabsorb the cellular connective tissue. You're not going to reabsorb the acellular connective tissue, and I've never seen you reabsorb the calcium component. Some people say nowadays, oh, you can reabsorb calcium. Maybe long-term, but for practical purpose, I wouldn't bank on that. Okay, and then here's a joking picture of, Caldwell Esselstyn being like an Old Testament God. And the reason I show that is what I'm saying is Esselstyn, I like what he says. He tells the patient, no oil, not one drop, no animal food, not one bite, no meat, not one bite. The point of it is that people who make a dramatic change, they often get a dramatic benefit versus what most people do. They go wimpy, half butt, and they say, I'm cutting down on oil, I'm cutting down on meat, I'm cutting down dairy, and they don't tend to do very well. You want 100% biblical. Thou shalt not eat meat. Thou shalt not eat oil. It's like, with an alcoholic, you don't tell an alcoholic you can drink on the weekend. You don't tell a smoker you can smoke on the weekend. You stop smoking. You stop drinking 100%. Okay, and then here's like the nearest comparative diet. This is sort of an optimized version of the Mediterranean diet called the Lyon study. And the Esselstyn diet had 32 times better results. I mean, it's basically... Even the optimized version of the Mediterranean diet is a joke, okay? I call the Mediterranean diet the Antichrist diet because it promises salvation, but it does not deliver. And I can also tell you, the vast majority of medical centers, more than 90% of them, probably about 95% of them in my experience, they all recommend the Mediterranean diet. It's totally stupid. It's what idiots, ignoramuses, and liars say when they want to pretend they know what they're talking about with nutrition. Okay, here's my book. I put this as number 10, The Medical Reformation Vegan Renaissance Bible. And so basically, I'm getting older. My kids are growing up. I sit around reading, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I went through all the textbooks. They're all wrong. They're all a joke. They're ridiculous. I put this painting here. This is by William Blake about Dante's Divine Comedy. And this is with Dante and Virgil. And they're at the gates of hell. And the sign above the gates of hell says, abandon hope, all ye who enter. And I joke that that's what conventional medicine is. The reason why obesity, diabetes, coronary artery disease, hypertension are called chronic diseases is because they never cure them. They tell you right up front, abandon hope. We will never cure you. And to me, it's like insane. It'd be like a sports team that says, we lose every game. We're the best. We're the standard. And it's like, you guys stink. Okay, they never cure it. Low-fat vegan diet cures diabetes, hypertension, obesity, coronary artery disease, quite often impotence as well. It cures these things all the time, routinely. It's expected. Autoimmune disease. Okay, and the unique thing about this book, I had written books before, but I had figured out how to draw pretty nice in terms of being able to make diagrams. And so the book is full of diagrams because that's one of the things I think I added to the whole process was a more study of the biochemistry. I was going to be a biochemist when I was younger. It's a long story. I initially had minored in chemistry at Stanford. So I was very interested in being able to draw things out on more of a molecular basis because these are some of the things that solidify the arguments for a low-fat vegan diet. Number one, the epidemiology is extraordinary. You look at a billion out of a billion rice eaters are skinny. In China, before 1970, you couldn't find a single fat person. Roy Swank went there about 1960. They couldn't find a single multiple sclerosis patient, okay? And Africa before 1957, they couldn't find a single person with rheumatoid arthritis, okay? When people eat low-fat, plant-based diets, they don't get these diseases, okay? A great paper was the Donison paper from the Lancet Journal of 1929, 1,800 consecutive admissions. Not a single patient with hypertension. If you go to the United States and you look at 1,800 black patients and measured their blood pressure, it'd probably be about 90% of them middle-aged and older that were hypertensive. But in Kenya, in 1929, zero out of 1,800 hypertensive patients. It's extraordinary. Okay, so anyways, when you eat fiber, it's used by the good bacteria to make short-chain fatty acids, in particular the 4-carbon butyrate. Butyrate goes to the gut lining cells called the enterocytes because the gut's called the enteric tract, and it's used to make tight junctions. The tight junctions keep these cells tightly together. It's only a single cell thick so that bad things can't get across that junction, okay? When you don't have these tight junctions because you don't eat enough dietary fiber or you're exposed to a lot of these modern toxic chemicals like oils, which are an unnatural processed thing. And there's a lot of other things that will do it. All kinds of food additives are toxic to the gut. A lot of medications are toxic to the gut. Excess psychological stress, caffeine, sleep deprivation will worsen it. Alcohol. There's a lot of things. They're all listed here. You start getting leaky gut, meaning increased intestinal permeability. And the bacterial endotoxins like LPS and LTA. Lipopolysaccharide is LPS from gram-negative bacteria. LTA is from gram-positive bacteria. They both do the same thing. They'll come into the subepithelial space. They'll cause a lot of inflammation in the gut. That can cause irritable bowel syndrome. It can cause ulcerative colitis. It can cause Crohn's disease, etc. And it will also then lead to these autoimmune diseases. You can get molecular mimicry with autoantibody cross-reactivity because big protein chunks can get through. Normally, only 3 amino acids at a time, a tripeptide, could be absorbed. This allows big chunks of protein. When they come from an animal, they're similar enough to our own proteins that the immune system recognizes them as foreign, but it still cross-reacts with our own body. So that's a bad situation. Okay, here's another thing I alluded to earlier, that you also are predisposed with leaky gut to being hyperthrombotic, hypercoagulable. And this is actually a very common thing that's not widely known. So here again, gram-negative to LPS, gram-positive to LTA, excess of dietary iron. All 3 of these things can cause what are called amyloid clots. So you start out with the blood clotting protein, fibrinogen, and it's in what's called an alpha helix configuration. Alpha helix looks like a slinky, and it's an individual molecule. But when exposed to these molecules, it changes its shape and it becomes flat. This is called secondary protein structure. You know, this is from basic biochemistry. Secondary protein structure will become beta-pleated sheet, and now it becomes flat, and they will stack up. The bigger a molecule gets, they stack up and they combine together. The bigger a molecule gets in aqueous solution, the human body's aqueous solution, water, the more likely it will precipitate out of solution. For blood clotting proteins to precipitate means to clot. So you'll start forming clots, and these microclots can plug up arteries in your brain. They can plug up arteries in your heart. They can cause something called microvascular angina, also sometimes called coronary syndrome X, where a person can have ischemic cardiac chest pain, even though if you do a coronary artery angiogram, cardiac cath, the arteries will be clean. So this is, how could somebody have a myocardial infarction but clean coronaries? The reason is a cardiac cath only shows you the epicardial coronaries, the big vessels on the outside surface of the heart. It doesn't show you the penetrating arterial branches that go into the myocardium, into the muscle, the intramuscular branches. So infections can do this. Viral infections can also cause amyloidogenic clotting. So what I'm saying is, if you have leaky gut, you know, you're predisposing yourself to not just autoimmune disease, but you're predisposing yourself to amyloidogenic clotting. And another thing I'd tell you to worry about is, it tends to be the same things that cause leaky gut tend to cause increased permeability of the blood-brain barrier. So it's a double screw job. You're not only allowing more toxins into your blood, but you're increasing the likelihood that these toxins might have some negative effect on your brain. So the smart move is eat what's natural for humans to eat, a high-fiber diet. Dr. Burkett had said that humans are supposed to eat typically around 100 grams per day of fiber, and the average American is only eating about 10 grams per day. Not good, okay? At a minimum, it's thought people should probably eat at least about 50. All right, and then also I write about, you know, my theory of ischemic spine disease. I won't go into too much here, but basically there had been some papers about ischemia being associated, lack of blood flow associated with degenerative disc disease. But what I figured out is it's associated with everything in spinal degeneration, and not just at 1 or 2 discs in the lumbar spine, but the entire spine from the sacrum, meaning the pelvis, all the way up to the skull. All the spine can do, like the Ralph Waldo Emerson quote of the 1800s, he said, the hedgehog is only one trick, but it's a very good trick. And that's all the spine can do. The spine's got proprioceptors. It senses segmental instability between 2 vertebrae and their disc space intervening. And when it senses there's abnormal motion, it just lays down bone to fuse that segment, because its job is to protect the spinal cord and the caudal equine nerve roots that come below. So it doesn't mess around. When there's abnormal motion, typically due to disc failure from ischemia, it will fuse that segment. And as soon as you fuse the segment, the adjacent segment now has to bear more weight, more stress, and it'll start to deteriorate. And the process will repeat. You get segmental, that's called adjacent segment accelerated degeneration. Okay, and so it'll fuse everywhere. This is called a dish osteophyte, bridging osteophytes anteriorly, interbody fusion across the vertebral bodies, OPLL, ossification of the posterior longitudinal ligament. I also go through the chemical things that weaken ligaments like F- and GP because those will predispose to spinal degeneration. By the way, I've seen many thousands of cases of all that stuff. It's super common. That's the main reason people have back pain. Everybody's always thinking about disc herniation. Do I need to go to the operating room? They don't realize the main problem with the spine is that it's ischemic. Just like ischemia, lack of blood flow, is the main problem with the heart and the brain and many other organs in the body, the Johnson, etc. Okay, and this is a thing on mitochondria. So what I'm basically saying is this paper, I go through really advanced pathophysiology, stuff that the doctors don't know. I own 7 biochemistry textbooks. Not a single one of them had anything about mitochondrial inhibitors. I knew mitochondria were playing a big role in diseases. So I start going through all the literature. I quickly found over 50 mitochondrial inhibitors. And tell me if you think these are common. You ever heard of Tylenol, metformin, Lasix, saturated fat, other fats to a lesser extent, lead, F-, PFOA, nonstick containers, omega-6 cooking oils made into toxic aldehydes like HNE, SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, standard treatment for depression, antibiotics, fluoroquinolones, beta-lactams, aminoglycosides. This is all really common stuff. In processed food, they put lots of antifungals, which means to prevent mold growth, okay? If you get mold in a processed food or a personal consumer product, it gets sent back. So there's tons of this stuff in personal care products. That's why I'm a total minimalist. You go into my bathroom, there's only one thing, a transparent bar of the simplest possible soap. That's it. I don't even use shampoo, conditioner, nothing. I don't use a dishwasher. I don't use laundry detergent in the clothes washer, okay? I'm a minimalist, and I like it that way. You save money, it's convenient, it works, okay? I don't even take my clothes to dry cleaner. Maybe I look like a slob. I don't care, because this TCE thing is associated with Parkinson's disease. It's a mitochondria inhibitor. That's trichloroethylene. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is a lot of these common chemicals, a lot of poor, pathetic people I see cognitively impaired every day, they're exposed to 10 or even 15 of these things. They don't even know it. And, they become demented. And once they're demented, game over. Okay. There's zero hope they're ever going to reverse their problem. So the smart move is to realize you're at risk for these things and stop the bad habits, okay? And here is Roy Swank with Dr. McDougall. This guy Swank is a genius. He's a genius too. McDougall's a genius too, both of these guys. Swank, when he was an MD, PhD from Harvard, he figured out the blood sludge component and that this was associated with multiple sclerosis. So high-fat diets cause the red blood cells to sludge together, to clump together. Rouleau formation is the French word for a stack of coins, which is what the red blood cells look like. This makes the blood thick, so their blood becomes like a milkshake rather than like water. That causes hypertension. But Swank also showed by measuring the oxygen level in the adjacent brain tissue that it was depleted of oxygen. In a hamster brain, he got a 35% drop in the oxygen being delivered to the brain cells by feeding a high-fat diet. In his experience, saturated fat was the worst form of fat for causing this. And he felt it was making the blood-brain barrier hypoxic, and that was facilitating the antibodies to get into the brain parenchyma and to cause multiple sclerosis. He has by far the best results of any doctor in the world, Dr. Swank. He has 34-year and even more follow-up on his multiple sclerosis patients. He started out in Canada with his clinical work originally as a neurologist. And I just say that because if you talk to a lot of modern neurologists, they're like, oh, well, we can't take that data seriously. I'm like, why wouldn't you? The best results in the world, why wouldn't you take that seriously? So we don't have time to go into the details of it. There's videos of Dr. Swank's work at Dr. McDougall's YouTube channel, so you can watch those. They're great. They're extraordinary. I also think this was my second favorite book. I've read a whole bunch of books on MS, by the way. One of the things I do, I started out as an imaging-guided surgeon, then I went into becoming a neuroradiologist. So I've seen tons and tons of multiple sclerosis, okay? This is the second best book on the subject. This is the one by Sari Stanchik. And she said a couple really good things. She said she looked at the identical twin data, and more often than not, only one of them got the multiple sclerosis. So it couldn't be a genetic disease if it wasn't, more common in identical twins. So that's valuable information. She said some funny things too. She said that a medical residency teaches a doctor how to become sick. They're totally sleep deprived. They're totally stressed out, and they eat whatever junk food they can get their hands on, and they stop exercising because they're working so much. So I thought that was kind of funny. So that's a good book too. Okay, the next book here is the China study. Oh, the other thing that's funny is I've read these other books. I've read a bunch of other books on MS, and let me tell you something. They all stink. They stink so bad it's not even funny. I can tell a book stinks because I go into the index at the back, and I look for the things you have to know. You have to be able to talk about excitotoxicity. You have to be able to talk about calcium physiology. You have to be able to talk about blood sludge, rouleau formation, tissue hypoxia. You have to be able to talk about heavy metal toxicity. And book after book, you'd be amazed. They don't go into any of these things. They're not even in the index. That's why a book that doesn't cover those things is a joke. I don't care what university. The famous universities typically are the worst ones because they're the ones that cater the most to the big drug companies because That's how they get their grant money. That's how they get promoted, is selling drugs. And they don't get promoted. They don't get money for curing the patient. No one cares about patients. I would say that's one of the first things you have to understand as a patient. No one cares about you. It is not in the doctor's interest to care about you. What happens to you is irrelevant. As long as the standard care is followed, it doesn't matter what happened to you. The doctor can't be sued. They can't get in trouble. So they have to have an obligation to fulfill the requirements for the billing code, to fulfill the requirements for the standard of care. Therefore, they can't be sued. Therefore, they get paid. And whatever happens to the patient really doesn't matter. The system, nobody keeps track of results. And the reason nobody keeps track of results is because if they did, somebody would come along with a low-fat, low-sodium vegan diet, and they would have the best results. And that would make all the drugs look bad. So that's why no one no one keeps the results. That way you can't know. Okay, the China study by T. Colin Campbell. The most important insight from this book was that animal protein is the most important cause of cancer. And he felt that milk protein, especially casein, was the most powerful cause of cancer out of everything known to mankind. And the gist of it is, look at a baby cow. It's gains like, what, 600 pounds in just a couple of months? So yeah, that's like miracle grow to make an animal grow fast. But the problem with it is, a baby's going to grow fast. That's fine. But as a person gets older, this is accelerating the rate at which cells replicate. Well, guess what? You don't want your cancer cells accelerating the rate they replicate at. Here's Caffeine Blues, book number 14 by Stephen Chernisky. And I like this book because he basically collated together all the negative studies on caffeine. Because a lot of people go around saying, oh, coffee is good for you and tea is good for you. Caffeine is good for you. BS. Even the world famous sleep experts, they get interviewed and they say, oh, coffee is good for you. Bunch of nonsense. Everybody knows stress is bad for you. Caffeine increases the exact same thing, cortisol and catecholamines. The reason why people BS on the internet is because if you tell the truth, you get ostracized, okay? If a sleep expert went around saying coffee was bad, he would never be interviewed on the popular channels. There's so many things bad about coffee, it's not even funny. I'm not going to go into all of them right now because it's a whole big subject, but just trust me, it's much, much worse than people think. Okay, diabetes. I think the best book on diabetes is the one by Roy Taylor. He won the Banting Award in 2012 as the best diabetes researcher in the world. He basically got a whole bunch of patients with diabetes. He did a baseline MRI, and I'm sure they had a fatty liver, got them to lose 30 pounds of weight, and these are people with diabetes like 4 years or less. Every single one of them was cured of diabetes, and you can see their blood glucose level, their fasting blood glucose level came down to normal. So the best way to lose weight long-term is eat a low-fat vegan diet. That's the best way to be cured of diabetes. So instead of taking a pill all your life like a chump, why not reverse it with diet right in the beginning and be done with it? Be cured. The pill will never cure you. You can't cure a dietary disease with a pill. Okay, these guys I think are quite good, so I give them an honorable mention. The Mastering Diabetes guys, they both got diabetes, and they got it when they were teens. Maybe it's 1.5 diabetes, but they're both smart, they're both nice, and they give a lot of useful advice. Okay, here's this guy, Gerald Shulman. This guy is a genius. He's an MD, PhD from Harvard and Yale, and they did nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy of the skeletal muscle. So like, let's say in your bicep, that's where about, the vast majority of your postprandial after eating glucose should go to be stored and used for glycogen, for example. And what he found is the accumulation of fat in a skeletal muscle cell is the first detectable finding of diabetes. That's a very important point. They typically call it intramyocellular lipid. You could watch his video on the internet. It's a fantastic video, Gerald Shulman. Okay, he lays it out real clear. Then here's another guy. I'd recommend this paper. I show these things because these diabetic patients, they're kind of screwed. Hardly of them ever get better. Most of them deteriorate. They're cognitively impaired by their mid to late 50s, and then they're screwed. And then they just go down the tubes, die of a myocardial infarction typically. Here's this guy, Michael Brownlee. This guy's an incredible genius. He wrote this paper here called The Pathobiology of Diabetic Complications, a Unifying Mechanism. I'm telling you, this paper is such an extraordinary work of genius. It's incredible. This guy is like the equivalent of Michelangelo for art, okay? The Sistine Chapel. When I read this paper, I almost started crying. It was so beautiful. It was so perfect. It was such an extraordinary work of genius. It was awesome, okay? You can get it at the American Diabetes Association website. If you search around, you might be able to find it at other places, but trust me, if you only read one paper about diabetes, it's the greatest paper ever written on diabetes. And he goes into the mechanism of how the fat, especially sad fat, is going to reverse electron transport at about the level of complex 3, and then it starts to back up. Then you start dropping electrons into the mitochondrial matrix. Then you start generating oxidative stress because the oxygen combines with those electrons to produce superoxides, and how that sets off a whole cascade of problems, okay, including advanced glycation end products. including, I'm not even going to go into all of it because there's so much stuff to go into. But trust me, if you want to get the scoop on diabetes, that's where you will find it. Okay, that in combination with Shulman. Those guys are the two geniuses that figured out diabetes in detail. All right, here is Advanced Nutrition and Human Metabolism by Serene Garoppolo. And this is one of my nutrition biochemistry books. This is the best one. And it's a little bit written like rural university, how do you fatten up cattle? And yeah, it's for humans, but so it's not like it's the best nutrition book, but it's the best you can find. And it'll tell you, you know, how is carbohydrates absorbed, how are fats absorbed, how are proteins absorbed. So a lot of good basic information. Okay, Stopping Kidney Disease, the Basics by Lee Hull. This is a real smart guy who had kidney failure. He wasn't a medical person, but he's a smart guy, and he studied everything about it. And, you know, the book's about, you know, 2 or 3 times as long as it has to be, but it's still a very good book. And the bottom line is, you know, 75% of the work of a kidney is to excrete nitrogen. So if you minimize your protein load, you give your kidneys a vacation. You minimize your vasoconstrictor, so you avoid sodium, eat more potassium, magnesium, and get your nitrate precursors from plants. That opens up the arteries to your kidney, and it works better. Okay, those are sort of the things you need to know. Plus, a plant-based diet's alkaline. The kidney's job is also to excrete acid, the protons. That's coupled to excreting calcium. Okay, so by avoiding the high calcium and by avoiding the animal proteins that are more acidic, thus putting a workload on the kidney to excrete those protons, the acid protons, you give the kidney a vacation, you don't form kidney stones, it's all good. So anyways, this is a very good book. Okay, here's Chef AJ's book. I think this is the best of the weight loss books. She had been overweight when she was younger, and she goes through her life experience of how she lost the weight, and it's the best of the weight loss books. There's her calorie density chart on the back, and that can help you very much to lose weight. This book right here is called The Estrogen Generation, and it's written by this guy, Anthony J. And some people will tell me, oh, Anthony J, he's, you know, he sometimes eats the paleo keto, blah, blah. You know what? I would not recommend Anthony J to be your source of nutrition information, but I can tell you he's a lipid biochemist, and this book about estrogen chemistry, it's the best book ever. I've read 5 books on estrogen chemistry. This is the best one by far. It's funny, it's clever, it's entertaining, it's concise. He makes the point. He's got good, easy to memorize charts. It's the best one. If you only read one thing about estrogen generation, you should read this. And I think it's a big deal to read this, especially if you have kids, because there is an infertility problem off the charts, and this will give you insight into that. You will want to avoid these estrogenic chemicals. They're ubiquitous in the environment because they're good preservatives, okay? So they're in everything. They put them in food. They put them in personal care products. It's a magnificent book, and it's fun to read. Okay, this book is also an excellent book. This is written by Neil Bernard. He's a very smart guy. He knows a lot. He's got a lot of experience, and he wrote an excellent book about hormones. And so you're interested in things like menopause and, you know, thyroid disease. This is an excellent book, Your Body in Balance. Okay, now these are the 2 researchers here. Her name is Etheresia Pretorius from South Africa. This is Douglas Kell from England. And they have a fantastic lecture on iron. And they didn't write a book on it, but if you want to watch videos about amyloidogenic clotting, iron overload consequences, they have fantastic letters. They're some of the most cited researchers. They both deserve Nobel Prizes. Okay, as far as reading about iron, the first book to read would be read Randall Laufer's book. Okay, he's wrote a book, actually not Iron and Human Disease. I only had that cover when I made this slide. His book, Iron and Heart Disease, is his best one. He's a PhD guy from Harvard. He's very clever and funny. He's the best one to read. Once you understand that, if you're interested in more, I've also got videos on all this stuff, but I would go from his lecture. Jim Moon's book summarizes a research study. Weinberg also has some good stuff on iron if you want to study iron. The bottom line, though, what are you going to do once you know all this stuff? What I do is I actually donate a little blood. I want to drop my serum ferritin down to 30 to 80. Because when you do that, you tend to avoid most of the problems related to iron. It's more complicated than that, of course, but that would be like the long-term target goal if you should become interested in iron. Okay, and I have much longer lectures so I go into all the rationale for everything. Here is The Blue Zones by Dan Buettner. He works with National Geographic. They basically looked up demographically around the world, where do people live the longest and the healthiest? And they came up with these 5 areas which they call the Blue Zones. Perhaps they're all near coastal areas, and some people said, oh, he just wanted to go on vacation in coastal areas. That's why he picked these areas. But you know what? I think the book's pretty good. I think it's logically consistent, and I think everything looked pretty good in the book. I can tell you, McDougall's a big fan of Buettner. And what came out of it? Loma Linda has the longest lived people. The vegan women are living about 88 and a half years, the men about 4 years less than that. That's the longest lived, well documented of any population in the world. Second longest was the Okinawans. Okinawa is like what Hawaii is to USA is Okinawa to Japan. It's just sort of the island south of there. And there was called the Shangri-La, the land of the immortals, really long-lived people. You get all these Okinawans doing push-ups when they're over 100 years of age. The thing that's sad now is they've brought in fast food restaurants into Okinawa, and now they're getting fat and sick like everybody else. As a matter of fact, in Japan, they got a lot more dementia than they used to, and they hired this one guy, Japanese neuroscientist, Tatsumori Yamashima, and he came to the conclusion it was mostly because they're eating fried food. Okay, so anyways, this is the Blue Zone. So it's still a great book, and all this stuff, you can watch videos. Just go on the internet, type in Blue Zones. You'll find it in 5 seconds. Blue Zones, Dan Buettner, National Geographic, you'll find it. And here's the diet chart. It's so obvious. You eat the standard American diet, you're screwed, the high-fat diet. If you eat, the old-fashioned white rice diet, they actually had the potential to be very healthy. What messed them up, though, was they were often eating really high sodium, like in Japan, 12 to 14 grams a day. And then they also were smoking cigarettes like a chimney. And that's why they had a lot of intracranial atherosclerosis and stroke. But they still lived pretty long. And if they hadn't been smoking and eating so much salt, they might have been the healthiest people in the world. They probably would have been. The thing now about the diet in India is people I know from India, lots of them, they eat way too much fried food. And that's what's making them sick. It's a long story, but I believe through the Yamashima mechanism, that's what's causing their markedly high incidence of diabetes. They also eat a moderate amount. Some of them do the ghee, the butter, dairy product. Look at a low-fat, low-sodium vegan, okay? You're better off in every single category. Why wouldn't you want that? I mean, once you understand, only an idiot wouldn't want that. That's what I do. I'm 60. I don't take any medical problems. Nobody makes any money off me. Everything works. That's what you hope for. Okay, and I got all these young people that can't concentrate. I concentrate 14 hours a day. I do it like every day. Okay, so you're messing yourself up. You're making yourself sick. A lot of these young people, I think they're like making themselves sick. They're eating all these supplements. It's stupid. They listen to some like bodybuilder or other BS artist on the internet, and they don't ever really study it, so they don't know what they're doing. This guy is kind of an interesting guy, Lauren Mosher. He's an MD psychiatrist. He was like the head of the whole Institute of Psychiatry in the United States. And he realized that the schizophrenic patients that stayed in the residential communities were doing much better. So he set up a residential living facility. The name of the book is called Soteria, which is the Greek word for deliverance. And he's talking about deliverance from madness. The bottom line is the people who lived in these residential homes, like apartment buildings, supervised by some assistants of his who weren't really trained that much in psychiatry or medicine, they had like an 85% return to community living and a successful functional life in terms of being able to hold down a job, get married, raise children, and all that kind of stuff. And whereas if you put them on psych meds, the antipsychotics, things like Haldol and all that, it was a very small percent, only like around 15% could return to community living. And so you would say, well, gosh, the guy should be celebrated. He should win a Nobel Prize. What a wonderful thing to save all these schizophrenic patients. Nope, he was declared as being biased against drugs and he got fired. That's what happens to real innovators in healthcare. Healthcare is not for helping patients. It's for selling drugs, okay? And you need to understand that, otherwise nothing will make sense. Okay, here's a book by Harold Koenig. This is book number 24. Is religion good for your health? And the bottom line is all the major religions, the people who are religious are all healthier, and that's also shown in Blue Zones. Okay, here's number 25, Psychology Seduction by William Kirkpatrick. And the gist of it is that the psychology of Christianity, for example, and the major religions, it is better than the psychology of psychology. When you tell me psychology, what I think is they are the modern priest of so-called modernism, of atheistic Darwinism. And they will go along with whatever fad comes along. Whatever fad comes along, oh yes, these are my new pronouns. Oh yes, here's my new rules. Versus this old-time stuff, these old-time religions say, follow the 10 Commandments, be nice to each other. That's what you need to know. Okay, and so what I'm trying to say is they do a lot of damage. They break up a lot of families. They push people towards these psychiatric medications. Psychiatric medications are very dangerous. Most of them cause a slow chemical lobotomy. They're totally overrated. The single neurotransmitter theory is bogus. Okay, and here's the idea, creating the image of God. And either mankind accepts the fact that we're creating the image of God and thus part divine, thus each individual should have, respect, privacy, and all that kind of stuff. And I like Ayn Rand's quote. Ayn Rand said, the smallest minority is the individual. If you respect the individual, then all the other rights will follow. But if you don't give individual rights, then you will have none. And that's where it comes from here, that it comes from man is created in the image of God, therefore entitled to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, free speech, property, etc. You either agree with it or you don't. And if you don't, and you accept what has now been accepted in Western societies, what I would call atheistic Darwinism, that's what's taught in the universities, that's what society runs on now. It says that mankind, he has no soul. There's no difference between him and any of the other apes except that he can talk. And thus he is not entitled to anything. And it is highly relevant, the metaphysics of the society, its moral foundation, whether it's based on man is created in the image of God, therefore he deserves our highest consideration as a partly divine creature, or he's just a talking monkey. And we've decided he's a talking monkey, and that's not good because talking monkeys have no rights. And this is where things are kind of headed unless people decide we want to keep the rights of man. And this is where it's headed. You know, I don't make the rules. That's just what's happening. And you look at the incredible creativity that generated, respecting the life of the individual rather than saying all that matters is myself and my immediate family. Thinking about mankind as a big family. And I wrote a book about this art because it's magnificent art. And it sort of ennobles mankind. It brings happiness into a cold winter, you know, all these lights. Rather than a bleak winter holiday of darkness and cold weather, you have something that lights you up and it gives you joy and it makes you happy. And all of this stuff determines how a society behaves. And sadly, we have nothing to replace it, and we're getting rid of all this old stuff, and I think that's a big mistake. Look at these old movies. They're marvelous. They're full of love and deep relationships between the people, whereas the modern movie, you look in the modern Hollywood movies, what do you see? A bunch of garbage. You see a bunch of action flicks with special effects. It's like for retards. It's terrible stuff. Okay, and that type of culture leads to this type of nonsense, and we don't want it to go to this. This is Thomas Cole's painting called Consummation and Destruction of Empire. Okay, it's a series of paintings. Magnificent paintings, Thomas Cole. He's the greatest story painter who ever lived, him and Michelangelo. All right, so here is book number 26, Brain Disabling Treatments in Psychiatry by Peter Breggin. He's the greatest psychiatrist who ever lived. And he basically said all psychiatric drugs cause a chemical lobotomy. They all cause brain damage, okay? You can't distort the function of a synapse, the connection between two neurons, without damaging it, okay? And the brain fights the drug. And as the brain fights the drug, you get secondary changes that become more and more irreversible. It can be very difficult to wean off these drugs. Here's another really smart lady, psychiatrist. She wrote a book called Drug-Induced Dementia, and she goes through systematically all the papers on how these drugs just cause brain damage. They really are terrible. Okay, as a matter of fact, one thing kind of funny, there was tremendous irrational exuberance for Prozac. It's also called fluoxetine back in like the 1980s, early 1990s. And if you look more recently in some of the papers on Prozac, you can look this up in 5 seconds. Prozac is now being recommended by some for treatment as chemotherapy. It's such a toxic drug. I thought that was kind of funny. Okay, Anatomy of an Epidemic. This is a guy by the name of Robert Whitaker, and he followed the long-term outcomes of a lot of patients receiving these psychiatric drugs, including children receiving, methylphenidate and other amphetamines for attention deficit disorder. And I'll tell you, it's totally ridiculous. The only reason this is being done is because it's profitable. If you were to go on a street corner and try to sell an amphetamine to a child or an adult, that would be illegal. But doctors give them every day in large amounts to children. It's insane. Okay, it's so insane. And the only reason it happens is because no one really cares about talking monkeys. Okay, that's what it comes down to. You know, if I asked any one of you in this audience, would you poison a child? I'll give you $10. You say, no way. I'll give you $100. No way. I'll give you $1,000. And I will bet you, you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do it. $1,000, you wouldn't poison a child. Yet doctors, MDs, every day poison children for less than $5. Okay? All right, here is Thomas Schaas. He's one of the great psychiatrists. And he said, labeling a child as mentally ill is a stigmatization, not a diagnosis. Giving a child a psychiatric drug is poisoning, not treatment. Clear thinking requires courage rather than intelligence. That's a big part of it, because if you start thinking clearly, you start contradicting traditional paradigms, and that can get you in trouble. That can cause you to lose money. That can cause you to be ostracized from your field, etc. So that's why so few do it. You get some young doctor out of training, they're in debt, you know, they got $500,000 of, you know, student loans. They can't rock the boat. They got to just keep their mouth shut, go with the standard of care, pay their bills, pay off their loans. Okay, and here's one of his great books called The Myth of Mental Illness, Thomas Schaas. Yeah, if you study this guy, you'll see he's brilliant. He's got a lot of good insights into mental health. Okay, here's a good book called number 30, Mike Adams, The Food Forensics. He has a machine to test the chemical contaminants in different foods, and he has chart after chart of having tested the chemical contaminants in many foods. And there's a lot of them out there. That's one of the reasons, too. Like a lot of people say, oh, don't you want some turmeric? I'm like, you know what? I know it sounds good, but it's often contaminated by lead. I don't want it. Okay, here's toxic. And there's a lot of other things that are like that. Like people think, oh, isn't tea wonderful? Well, it's often contaminated by aluminum and fluoride. No, thank you. I don't want it. Okay, and I don't want the caffeine. All right, Toxic Legacy by Stephanie Seneff. Not to mention other ways it can be toxic. All right, she did a tremendous amount of research on this stuff, glyphosate, that is sprayed on soy. Soy tends to be the cheap protein on processed foods, all right? And there's tons of problems with it. She goes through all the things that this is associated with. Believe me, it's associated with increased risk of cancer. She describes how it's associated with damaging collagen and ligaments. It's associated with fatty liver. It's associated with leaky gut. It's associated with being an excitotoxin. It's associated with increased risk of cancer and lymphoma. Much worse than you could imagine. Okay, here's this stuff, a book about mercury. This book's kind of funny too. This lady here is an internal medicine doctor in the San Francisco Bay Area, and she started getting referrals of these yuppies, you know, young urban professional patients, early middle age, becoming demented. And she's like, why are all these people demented? Nobody knew how to test for it. She figured out how to more accurately test for mercury in the blood, and she found out almost all of them. It's because they were eating fish. She renamed it fish fog, and she got them to stop eating the fish, and a lot of them were able to reverse and come back to pretty good function. Some of them, though, was already irreversible. So that's what was funny about it. There were yuppies who were, you know, thought they were smart. They read the stupid magazines, and they start thinking that fish is good for you. Fish is for chumps, okay? It's totally acidic, super high in fat. It's full of chemicals. The ocean's a sewer. You don't want to eat fish. It's for chumps, okay? And all these people became demented from eating fish. I thought that was funny. All right, here's a book by Dr. Renee Dufault, and she had done research that found that high fructose corn syrup was routinely contaminated with mercury. As they push it through a chloralkali vat, it would get mercury in it. And here's what was funny. They would advertise high fructose corn syrup as being a preservative, but the reality was it was a preservative because it contained mercury, which is a major brain toxin. So I thought that was kind of funny. Then here's F minus. So F minus, what a joke. The best book on it is this one right here, written by this guy, Murphy. He's a dentist, and he reviewed all the papers on all the different anatomic systems in the body with regard to F minus. It's the best book. Okay, but these other ones are quite good. This one is from Muyamis. It's hard to say his name. He's a biochemist, though, and he reviewed a little bit of the mechanistic stuff about why F minus is so toxic, how it can substitute for hydrogen and other molecules, and therefore it's very insidious. It basically causes a little damage here, a little damage here, a little damage here, a little damage here. It's a slow poison, and it damages enzyme systems throughout the body. It's an inhibitor of glycolysis. It's an inhibitor of some of the Krebs cycle enzyme. It's an inhibitor of the intermitochondrial membrane, okay? It's an inhibitor of the glutathione antioxidant system. It damages collagen. It just gets all over the place. It increases cancer risk. It causes lowering of IQ. I mean, it's bad in numerous ways. This book is an honorable mention book, and this is kind of a fun book. I just read it for the heck of it because, you know, I was interested in the spine. I was interested in this toxicity. So this guy right here is a neurosurgeon in India, and there's areas in India that have high amounts of F minus in the water. I thought, oh, that's interesting. So he'll have experience with populations exposed to larger amounts, causes accelerated aging. Yeah, you expect that. Some things that were really, I thought, kind of interesting. He says F minus tends to be high where there's volcanic rock, and I'm like, well, hold on a sec. What about Fiji water? Fiji water is touted by a lot of experts as the most healthy water because it contains silica. Silica is a chelator for aluminum, so it gets the aluminum out of your body. And everyone's like, yay, isn't that wonderful? Prevents aluminum-related dementia, yay. But then you look at it more carefully. Well, guess what? Fiji comes from a volcanic rock spring. So then you look up F minus, and it's about 0.24 parts per million, which is really high. And that F minus is a major neurotoxin. So you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. You're screwed. So I think Fiji water is overrated for that reason. The other thing is the longer distance a water has to travel, bottled water, before it gets to, let's say, the USA or something, the more time water, a natural solvent, has to dissolve that plastic. So the more plastic gets into the water, the less pure it is. Well, plastics tend to be estrogenic, like terephtalates and stuff. So the best thing you could do is have a reverse osmosis filter in your kitchen sink and use that. That's what I'd recommend, and store it in a glass bottle. I think that's the best you're going to do. You could do distillation, but distillation gets into a lot of issues. It's complex, time-consuming, more expensive, etc. That's a big subject. We don't have time to get into that right now, but I thought this was quite an interesting book because he's got a lot of experience with high F- exposures, and he goes through all the issues with it and how it can also mimic spinal degenerative disease, and I think it contributes to it. Okay, here's the guy who wrote the big book on AL. This guy, his nickname is Mr. Aluminum. He's a real clever guy. All right, Brain Fables. I like this book because what it basically says, this guy's a neurologist researcher on Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease, and he basically comes right out and says that The current research that's been done on Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's is mostly a joke. The patients have not been categorized effectively such that we don't have any meaningful insight into how to help them. So I thought that was funny that he was honest. Okay, that's why he calls it brain fables. He says most of the neurodegenerative paperwork is a big joke. Okay, and also, like I said, I'm a neuroradiologist. I have my own theory of neurodegenerative disease that does make sense, okay? And the reason why these guys never come up with anything is because they're always stuck in the same old paradigms where they have to kiss butt to the drug companies in order to get grant money. So they never, like, open their brain and, like, look at reality, okay? So they don't even know what they're talking about. I'll get into that later. Here's an honorable mention book, again, by Neil Bernard. He's a real bright guy. And he went through how there's a strong increased incidence of dementia, cognitive impairment, people who eat diets that are high in saturated fat, for example. And he also talks about some of the heavy metal toxicity. So I thought that was useful. That's a good book. Okay, here's a great book. This is a magnificent book, Alzheimer's Turning Point by Jack Delatorre. This is a guy with a researcher, PhD in Texas. He would tie off the carotid artery of a mouse, and then about 2 months later, the mouse would become demented, middle-aged and older mice. He then did an autopsy, and when he's looking at the brain, he's expecting a big stroke, but there's no stroke. The brain is simply shrunken, a shrunken brain. What does that mean? It means apoptosis, a gradual progressive loss of individual brain cells, individual neurons. Why? Because of lack of vascular perfusion, a lack of blood flow. So chronic lack of oxygen is chronic hypoxia. And chronic lack of glucose, hypoglycemia, relatively speaking, because you can't deliver enough glucose to your brain cells. They need a lot of glucose. And so they just become, they just die. So he's just tying off the internal carotid right artery here. He actually did experiments where he tied off both carotids, tied off the vertebral arteries, tied off the middle cerebral artery, etc. But the point of the matter is the brain cells didn't get enough oxygen and glucose, and mice would become demented. And there's good reason to believe the same thing is happening in humans. Okay, here's how I draw the mouse having the carotid tied off. And here's what I call mouse equivalents. People will say, well, how many people have severely stenotic or occluded internal carotid arteries in their neck? Not that many. Yeah, right, but there's a whole bunch of mouse equivalents. Atrial fibrillation, you lose the atrial filling about 25%. You're like the mouse. I call it a mouse equivalent. Congestive heart failure, you don't got good pumping pressure to the brain. You're like the mouse. You got hypertension that causes intracranial atherosclerosis, which decreases oxygen and glucose delivery to your brain cells. But guess what? Drug companies keep dropping the threshold to treat. Remember, McDougall would say he wouldn't even treat somebody unless they had a chronic prolonged systolic over 160 or over 150 at home for months. Well, if you drop that threshold to treat to 140 and you keep those blood pressures low, you're potentially basically creating mouse equivalents. Think about it. Why do you have a blood pressure? To get blood to the top of your brain, your cerebral cortex on the upper convexities. You have to pump that blood against gravity. We talked about how fat causes hypertension, because if you're pumping a milkshake, thick blood, because of the fat sticking the red blood cells together, you got to pump at a higher pressure. If you have a lot of sodium on board, vasoconstricting the arteries, you got to pump at a higher pressure to get it through narrowed arteries. All right. So what I'm saying is if you overtreat that hypertension, though, and you still eat the same high-fat, high-sodium diet, then you don't have as much pumping pressure to get enough blood up to the brain. You're going to potentially be a mouse equivalent. Okay. And by the way, I can tell you, my internal medicine friends, and in my own personal experience, is pretty true. You show me a patient over 60, I will show you somebody who's cognitively impaired. They know how to find their way home, most of them, but they're very cognitively slow. They've lost their nuance, their spontaneity, their zest, their vitality. So, that's a typical life for an American, is to be fat, sick, and stupid by the time they're in their late 50s. So you don't want to end up like that. Low-fat vegans, they're still going strong for many years after that, typically. Okay, let's see. What else? Post-CABG hypotension. So coronary artery bypass graft, they'll run the patient real low in their blood pressure initially because they don't want them to bleed at the anastomosis where they plug in the arterial grafts. And then you can get something called pump head. A significant number of patients have some cognitive slowing after open heart surgery for coronary artery disease. Not good. And there's other things that will cause it. High-fat diets are associated with OSA, obstructive sleep apnea, and brain hypoxia at night. I'll see patients from sleep studies dropping their SATs into the 60s at night. A lot of diabetics, they give themselves too much insulin or other medication, and they're hypoglycemic at night. And that's now better known because you got continuous glucose monitors, and you look at their blood glucose overnight. They're often markedly hypoglycemic at night. So you can see how all these things can add up. If you don't got a good enough pumping pressure to the brain, you got sleep apnea, you got hypoglycemia, you're making life pretty difficult for those neurons. So here's some examples of intracranial atherosclerosis. Okay. And here's what it looks like on an individual capillary. So this yellow thing is the basement membrane of a capillary. These are the red blood cells flowing from here to here. These spindle-shaped cells in the background, those are the endothelial cells that line the little arterial capillary. These green cells are the vascular smooth muscle cells. This is a normal capillary. The red blood cells pass through, they deliver oxygen. The blue circles are oxygen, and they go to the neuron here. All right. Now, here's what happens in a typical American. They'll have a thickened capillary basement membrane because of their diabetes. Okay, it's being glycated. They got hypertrophy of the vascular smooth muscle cells in the arterial wall. It's going to increase the distance from this oxygen reaching the cell. That's going to drop oxygen delivery a little bit. In addition, there'll be collagen thickening in here, and it's going to make it harder for oxygen to get to the neuron. So you're causing a gradual, progressive decrease in the oxygen and glucose delivery to these neurons. Okay, and that's going to increase your likelihood of going into apoptosis. The skull and crossbones is the site where this most commonly occurs. This is where we get all these association cortex. Well, it's actually deep white matter strokes. Okay, and the reason is these are end arteries. It's not well collateralized. And, you know, to get blood up over the top of the convexities, these penetrating arteries, there's not a lot of good blood flow to this area. So if you mess that up from diabetes, hypertension, atherosclerosis, overtreatment of hypertension, you'll often see strokes in this area. I see these every day. And a single patient could have over 100 of them, and they just become super. So here's a normal looking brain, normal sized ventricles. The dark stuff is the cerebral spinal fluid. This is a flare sequence. It's basically like a T2 sequence with CSF suppression of the fluid. Okay, so here's what it looks like in a pathologic brain. Like this would be like a typical American 80-year-old. The ventricles are big because the brain is atrophied. You can see the sulci along the convexities of the brain are enlarged compared to over here. A young brain like this, I'd call this a good-looking brain, a tight brain. When we say a brain is tight, what we mean is the brain is up close to the skull, the inner table of the skull, versus this is more of an elderly atrophic brain. And you can see there's cerebral spinal fluid penetrating deep into the individual sulci. The brain has separated itself from the skull. This is all cerebral spinal fluid around there. So this brain is more loose, more atrophic, as well as you have central atrophy such that the ventricles are expanded outward. See how much bigger they are here than they are here? That's because of atrophy of the deep white matter tissue. And all these white spots, these bright spots, these are spots where brain tissue has been destroyed. And these will often only cause minor problems. These are often, you know, these are not typically your massive strokes with hemiplegia and all that. These are just progressive cognitive slowing, slowness of motion, worsening of memory. I see these all the time. But the main thing I see with demented brains is just atrophy, bigger and bigger enlargement of these sulci and the cerebral ventricles. Okay, so, you know, don't let this happen to you. Okay, now here's an interesting guy. This guy named Russell Blaylock. He wrote a brilliant book around 1997 called Excitotoxins. And this talks about how certain stimulants like MSG, monosodium glutamate, can cause accelerated function of the neuron, raising its metabolic rate. And his father had died of Parkinson's, and he felt that it was part related to excitotoxicity. So excitotoxicity means overstimulation of a neuron, okay? And he felt that aspartame was related to that as well because it contains aspartate, and aspartate is an excitatory amino acid. Because, you know, think about glutamate. It's an excitatory amino acid. Cysteine is an excitatory amino acid. Glycine is an excitatory amino acid. So amino acids are often neurotransmitters. Here's what a typical neuron looks like. Here's the cell body over here. Here's the dendrites, dendrite from tree, like incoming information. If the cell decides to fire an action potential, it begins right here at the axon hillock. It's transmitted down the length of the axon till it reaches the axon terminal. The depolarization from the sodium causes opening of the voltage-gated calcium channel. That lets calcium come into the axon terminal. The calcium increase in the cytoplasm will cause the neurotransmitter vesicles to travel to the plasma membrane of the synaptic cleft. They'll release their neurotransmitter and then activate the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so that's the typical activity of a neuron. And the thing to remember is that when calcium goes up, the cell does whatever it does. Okay, so here's more detail of the synaptic cleft. The glutamate is the neurotransmitter. We talked about earlier, glutamate, increased transmission of glutamate by psychological stress, by caffeine, by sleep deprivation. It activates first the AMPA receptors. They let sodium come into the cell. That depolarizes the cell, and then that causes opening of the NMDA channel. I don't need to go through all that detail, but the point I'm trying to make is the more glutamate you send across this synapse, the more activation you have of the postsynaptic neuron. And there's other things that can activate this calcium channel. Aspartate, we talked about that from aspartame. Glycine, of course, is the amino acid, but it's also glycine phosphate, GP, from processed food, non-organic GMO food, is thought to also be an excitotoxin in this role in causing increased activation of this site. Okay, beta amyloid protein can also activate the NMDA receptor to allow more calcium into the postsynaptic neuron. And the relevance is, The same enzyme that clears insulin from the blood in the peripheral part of the body outside the brain is called insulin degrading enzyme. And if you have high insulin levels because you're eating high fat diets, you use up the insulin degrading enzyme and it's not available then to remove the beta amyloid protein, and you'll get increased activation of this NMDA receptor. Not good. You don't want that. Okay, Fat, Stressed, and Sick. There's a good book written by this lady, Catherine Reed. She's a PhD protein biochemist. Her daughter had autoimmune disease. I'm sorry, not autoimmune. Her daughter had autism. And she freaked out, you know, she wanted to help her daughter. So she started reading everything she could about autism. And she found out that for her child, the child was very sensitive to glutamate. So she wanted to minimize the glutamate in the child's diet to avoid MSG, to avoid MFG, manufactured free glutamate. And by the way, elevated amounts of manufactured free glutamate are associated with increased risk of autism, okay? Elevated amounts of dietary F- are associated with increased risk of autism, okay? And it's also thought, well, there's more to it than that. And there is obviously it's a bigger problem than that. But I'm letting you know the processed food companies, they do research studies. They bring a bunch of people in and they just adjust how much fat, how much do we fry it, how much sweetening with high fructose corn syrup or aspartame, how much manufactured free glutamate in there. People have taste receptors for glutamate. And they try to get the mouth texture, the salt just right, to hit the bliss point, which is maximum pleasure in tasting that food. They call them hyper palatable, so they'll become addicted to it. What they do is they make something called MFG, manufactured free glutamate, whereas they just chop up the protein into little bits. They'll take a protein at baseline, has a lot of G's, which is glutamate, and when they break up these individual amino acid connections, now this glutamate is free, and that's what MFG is, manufactured free glutamate. And so they don't even need MSG anymore. They just get a lot of manufactured free glutamate, and that makes people get addicted to foods. It's an unnatural thing. This lady wrote an interesting book. She's not a health person, Bruni Brody, but she's real smart. And her child had like a chronic fatigue type of syndrome. And she hired a bunch of scientists to figure out what it was. And it turned out that he had real sensitivity to SERCA inhibitors, sarcoplasm, endoplasmic reticulum, calcium ATPase. We're not going to go into all the detail of that. But the reason why I was fascinated by it was it relates to the calcium metabolism in brain cells and neurons. And I liked the book because it got me motivated to read a whole bunch of papers about SERCA inhibitors. So here's SERCA, sarcoplasm, endoplasmic reticulum, calcium ATPase. Endoplasmic reticulum is a calcium storage site in a neuron. The sarcoplasm word just comes from muscle. It's not even really relevant to the neurons, but that's why it's there. And then Ca is for calcium ATPase because it uses an ATP. And it just pumps calcium from the cytoplasm of the cell into the endoplasmic reticulum because the key is to get the concentration down in the cytoplasm. If you inhibit SERCA, then you're going to be less able to quickly lower the concentration of calcium in the cytoplasm. That's the relevance of it, okay? The NACA exchanger, sodium calcium exchanger, is the most important thing to pump calcium out of a neuron. The plasma membrane calcium ATPase, it's helpful, but this is much faster. You need ATP for all of them. And what would happen is you would get yourself into a vicious cycle. The worse your diabetes, the more dysfunctional, because of advanced glycation end products, the more dysfunctional your SERCA would become. And so they would both kind of cause each other. So what I'm trying to say is I see this, all these diabetic patients, it's like they're being dragged down into health hell. And, you know, you got to snap out of it if you're smart. The faster, the sooner the better, okay? Minimize your dietary fat. Otherwise, you get stuck in these vicious cycles of SERCA inhibition, diabetes, worsening SERCA inhibition, worsening diabetes. And it contributes to the other things in there, you know, the hypertension, the obesity, and the intracranial atherosclerosis. Cognitively impaired. I can tell you the diabetics are some of the stupidest people I ever meet. The stupidest people I ever meet, I would say, would probably be like kidney failure patients because it's very prothrombotic. Kidney failure is really prothrombotic, and they plug up all their arteries. They become very cognitively slow. And then after that, I would say diabetics. There's multiple reasons why diabetes makes people cognitively impaired. And then the third group of really stupid people I routinely see are obstructive sleep apnea. And those patients, you know, their brain's hypoxic at night. They're very sleepy. People think they got narcolepsy. And all of these things, you can avoid them going low-fat vegan, all right? Oh, this is one book that I wrote called Poor Man's Way to Prevent Dementia, and that also elaborates on my theory of cognitive impairment. First of all, I'll just briefly mention cortisol. All the green arrows are things that cortisol increases. All the red arrows are things that cortisol decreases. For our purposes, it increases glutamate in the hippocampus, that excitatory neurotransmitter. About 90% of brain neurotransmitters are glutamate, like in the cerebral cortex, okay? And that's what really matters because that's like a light switch. Turning the light switch on is glutamate. The opposite is GABA. GABA turns the light switch off. That's about 5% of neurotransmitters. And then all the real famous ones that everybody's heard of, they're actually all really rare, about in the ballpark of 1%. That's things like serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, stuff like that, norepinephrine. Okay, what else does cortisol do? It suppresses your libido, your fertility, decreases blood flow to the gut, decreases sensitivity to pain. Because remember, you can remember all this stuff is everything here happens to help you to survive when being chased by a tiger in the dark. Okay, it suppresses your immune system because if you're just trying to run from a tiger or climb a tree, you're not worried about your immune system, preventing cancer. Okay, but if you're chronically stressed out, you chronically have a suppressed immune system, you're more vulnerable to infections and to cancer. Not good. Okay, as people age too, their immune system gets weaker, so they become a little more fragile. And so they got to be even more careful about their health habits or they end up being sick. Okay, and also cortisol increases your blood lipids, it increases your blood glucose level. So it's obviously going to increase insulin resistance, and that's what I'm saying. Caffeine does this. Caffeine does everything here. It increases cortisol. So that's why when some genius tells me, oh, caffeine is good for you and coffee is good for you, I'm like, yeah, right, you BS artist. Why don't you open a book and read a couple of papers? Okay, decreases blood supply to the brain while simultaneously increasing glutamate transmission. It's a double whammy bad, okay? It also increases calcium release from the ryanodine calcium channels in the endoplasmic reticulum. There's a triple whammy. Okay, so it's bad for the brain. All right, so anyways, I've made longer videos separately. We don't got time to get into all of it now, but caffeine and coffee, I think that's all for chumps. All right, here's voltage-gated calcium channel, increasing calcium inside the neuron axon terminal. Cortisol also binds here and causes an increase in glutamate transmission across the neuron. So these are excitatory things. Stress, caffeine is a stress equivalent. Sleep deprivation is a stress equivalent. Everybody's all seen that in their own life. You're sleep deprived, you become more impulsive, you say and do stupid things. Okay, voltage-gated calcium channels typically opened up by action potentials, also opened up by EMF. These are ways that you cause increased glutamate going across that synapse, causing activation of the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, this is the astrocyte, the supporting cell. They call them the mama cells of the brain. Okay, so the neuron is the active cell transmitting neurotransmitters, but the astrocyte is the supportive cell. Okay, it's always going to be an oversimplification, but that's basically what it comes down to. All right. Now, here's a little bit more complexity showing how the astrocyte, it clears the glutamate from the synapse. It takes the glutamate, converts it into glutamine because the glutamine is not active. Then it can send the glutamine through the extracellular space. It'll diffuse back to the neuron, and that can be reconverted into glutamate. Okay, so that's sort of the recycling mechanism. These are the excitatory amino acid receptors. The R is always for receptor. So it clears the synapse, and it's important that it does that. If you overflow the synapse with glutamates for multiple reasons, because your cortisol is too high, your EMF to like crazy, you're drinking caffeine, you're drinking aspartame, all this other stuff, and you're eating a high-fat diet, so you got less insulin-degrading enzyme, you got beta-amyloid protein accumulating over here, you'll start spilling glutamate over to the extrasynaptic glutamate receptors, and these guys are harder to turn off. They overactivate the postsynaptic neuron, increasing your risk of excitotoxicity. So they cause brain damage, okay? It's not good. All right, here's just showing GABA. GABA is like a chloride channel. When the chloride comes up, it's negatively charged, so it helps to restore the membrane polarization, negative charge inside the plasma membrane of the axon terminal. So this inhibits, it counteracts the effect of voltage-gated calcium channels. It counteracts the effect of cortisol. So GABA is your friend when you're trying to turn off a neuron. And I hope you've realized what I've talked about here is overexciting your brain cells. Well, guess what? This is one of the reasons why a processed food diet overexcites the brain cells, and it can make a person anxious. It can cause insomnia because you're overstimulating your neurons. You don't want to do that. You know, these effects have a little bit of a similarity to caffeine, as we just spoke about. Not exactly, of course, the same thing, but overstimulation in your neurons can lead to poor attention. It can lead to impulsive behavior. It can lead to attention deficit-like behavior. It can lead to anxiety. So one of the first things I would do would be to avoid all these things. Avoid aspartame. I would never eat it. Learn how to manage your stress. Get your sleep. Avoid caffeine. All of these things can help to calm a person down. And much better if you can calm yourself down by improving your diet and your habits and your habitual ways of thinking, your personal metaphysics, sense of purpose, so you cannot get stuck on these psych meds that cause a slow lobotomy. Get it? Okay, so here's aspartate from aspartame, cysteine, a little bit more of a meat protein. Here's glyphosate, beta-amyloid protein. We talked about high-fat diets leading to higher BAP. Beta-amyloid protein's BAP, and that also increases activation of the NMDA receptor. Also, a lot of people are deficient in magnesium because they don't eat enough plants. Magnesium is the calcium channel blocker. It blocks the NMDA receptor here in the brain cells, So it helps prevent overexcitation of the postsynaptic neuron. So it protects you. Most common deficiencies are magnesium, potassium, because people don't eat the plant foods, and fiber, because people are deficient in plant foods. That's what they're deficient in. They're not deficient in 20 different supplements. They're deficient in plant foods, and that's where the good stuff is. You need the potassium for the ATP pumps, like we talked about over here. You need the magnesium to block the NMDA receptor. Okay. You need magnesium for every single ATP reaction because it holds the second and the third phosphate in place so they don't break apart. So if you don't have that, you're kind of screwed. You can't really run your metabolic systems effectively. You're not going to be at your top level of functioning. And you got to get that calcium out of the boat. So imagine this boat is a brain cell, and these are the calcium pumps. You got to pump like crazy through the knock exchanger can remove over 1,000 calcium molecules in a second. And so they've got to be working their little tails off. And that's what I'm saying is you don't want SERCA inhibitors preventing your ability to pump calcium out of the cytoplasm. You don't want anything damaging your channels, letting too much calcium in or blocking your ability to pump it out. There's lots of things that increase calcium channels. We don't have time to go into this, but what I'm saying is this is all part of my theory of cognitive decline, that basically people have an oversupply of stimulants increasing the metabolic rate, the demand of the neuron for oxygen and glucose delivery. I jokingly call OGD, oxygen glucose delivery, GOD, glucose oxygen delivery, because GOD, you know what that means. All right, so I was just having fun there. But we talked about the dilatory issues of hypoperfusion of the brain, lack of blood supply to the brain. We talked about inhibitors of SERCA, inhibitors of mitochondria. All of these things are preventing a brain cell from doing what it needs to do. And the typical America is going in the wrong direction on 10 of these, quite often 20 of them. And they're giving themselves brain damage. And I'm the one who figured this all out. I mean, other people did tons of research to generate little parts of it, but I figured it out from a biochemistry, nutritional point of view, neurophysiology point of view, and put it all together. This is the Peter Rogers theory of supply and demand. I also call it the neurovascular uncoupling theory. Okay. Here's the next book here, number 43. This one is written by Dr. Joseph Mercola. And, a lot of people will complain about some of the things he does. He's always trying to sell stuff. Fine. But he is a smart guy, and he wrote a great book called EMF, where he goes through the issues with EMF toxicity. This guy, Martin Blank, he's a researcher who also studies EMF, and it's a good book. The Mercola book's better, but this is a good book. Okay, this guy right here, Martin Paul, he's a genius. He's a physicist, and he was interested in chronic fatigue patients and some other rare diseases, trying to understand their mechanisms. And being a physicist, he's pretty good on the electrical aspects of it. He has some biology training, but he's a little bit like an Asperger autism, so he's a little bit monotone, but the guy's a genius. I read all his books, his papers, watched his videos. Trust me, if you want to study some of these weird brain diseases like the no pathway, you're going to want to read Martin Paul. Okay, he's very unique and brilliant work. Okay, next guy, Travis Christofferson. Now, Travis Christofferson, he's got something like a master's degree in biochemistry or something, and he's a really good teacher. And he's a good writer. He wrote this book, Tripping Over the Truth. And the biggest point of this book was he explains in good detail the metabolic theory of cancer. He explains the reason why the somatic mutation theory, which is one used by conventional medicine, is largely bogus. That's highly important information if you want to understand a cancer patient. And he basically says that the Otto Warburg theory is correct. And the nice thing about the metabolic theory of cancer is once you understand it, there's lots of things you can do to minimize your risk of getting cancer and have better results. Kelly Turnell, this is book number 46, Radical Remission. She was working at a major cancer center out east. She got a patient who had survived for a long, long time with metastatic cancer that was poor prognosis. She started asking the patient, how'd you do it? And the patient explained to her all the things that they did. And then she ran to talk to the doctors, and doctors weren't interested. Like, it's anecdotal information. So what? One patient got lucky. So what? That doesn't mean anything. And she was curious about it. So she started reading all these case reports about patients who survived a very long time, like say multiple decades, with metastatic cancer, that were told you got a couple months to live, make a will. And she noticed there were characteristic patterns amongst them. So she then tried to find out how to contact them. And she was able to directly contact about 100 of them. She even drove to their houses and interviewed a lot of them. And she wrote a book saying these are the things that they do. What do? They tend to take charge of their own care. They tend to eat a plant-based diet. They tend to exercise a lot. And let's say a prostate cancer patient, the guy would check his PSA, he'd make changes in his behavior and his diet, and then he would recheck his PSA. If it started going up, he would not do the things that made it go up. If it was going down, he'd keep doing the things that make it go down. He was using a empirical method to maintain a low PSA, and that's reminiscent of the Ornish study, where patients who went vegetarian and did a few other things, they all kept or lowered their PSAs. Here's the famous Ruth Heidrich, PhD lady, marathoner, triathlete, and she survived metastatic breast cancer for like over 40 years, okay? So she had an extraordinary result. She went to Dr. McDougall. She said after talking to Dr. McDougall, it only took her 2 hours to become a vegan, okay? They told her, make a will, you're going to be dead in a couple months. She said, no, I want to run a marathon. She became a low-fat vegan. She ran marathons and triathletes for many, many years. So there's a lot of videos of her, and this is one of her books. So it's really good stuff. Okay, here's another lady who was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer, and she was a marathon runner, and her husband, too, was a marathon runner. They ran the periphery of Australia. They ran a marathon every single day for 365 days in a row to run around the entire periphery of Australia to sort of like raise awareness of the situation. And this is the book she wrote. It's rather extraordinary. And again, you're talking a plant-based diet. The reason why exercise, I think, helps a lot. You don't want to, being a marathoner is a little crazy, but you want to get significant amount of exercise every day because it increases pumping of your lymphatics, which moves your white blood cells throughout the body to remove cancer cells. It increases lymphatic flow about 10 to 30-fold exercising. So it's a good thing. Pretty common. It also, I think, helps living in a warm climate. You got more access to plant. Here's another lady who survived metastatic breast cancer at least about 25 years. Okay, she's a real smart lady, and she noticed that, gee, the cancer doctors don't seem to have better survivals, that good a survival from cancer. Is that really what she should be doing? Is imitating them? And she also made observations that conventional medicine, they're really not that good at curing a lot of diseases. And she basically described the idea of eating a low-fat, plant-based diet as God's way of healing, because that's what we're designed to eat, going back to Genesis 1:29, etc. And so she's actually a brilliant lady. She was a surgeon. She was chief of surgery, chief of orthopedic surgery and trauma surgery at a UCSF General Hospital. And trust me, that's a pretty prestigious place. That's like as prestigious as Stanford and Harvard. And she was the chief of orthopedic surgery. So she was a big shot doctor. And she's actually surprisingly smart, that lady. She's a little crazy. She's a genius. All geniuses are a little crazy. So if you wanted to study geniuses and you decided to not study any of the geniuses that were crazy, you would have no geniuses. You'd have none to study. So I'm just telling you, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, okay? This is a book I wrote on The Poor Man's Way to Fight Cancer. And basically, I read everything you can read on cancer and all the nutritional stuff, the metabolic theory stuff, and I wrote this book because a lot of people ask me about cancer. So I summarized it all in one book. Here's ischemic spine where, like I said, I work as a neuroradiologist. I used to run a spinal injection clinic doing all kinds of transpedicular spine biopsies, epidural steroids, selective nerve root blocks, discography, all that stuff. I even did acupuncture in my previous life. So after studying all this stuff, and all my neuroradiology colleagues will tell me I'm absolutely right, and my other spine doctor friends, the ischemic component of degenerative disc disease, as well as the biochemical components of GP and F minus, destroying the ligaments, and how you get spinal degeneration, autofusion, all the way up from the sacrum to the skull. Okay, so I wrote all about that because that's the most common thing I see with back pain. I don't see that often in disc extrusion. Yeah, I've seen plenty of them, but the other stuff's a lot more common. Here's a trilogy of books I wrote, and then here's a book I wrote about biochemistry. This is before I knew how to illustrate. Once I knew how to illustrate and could put color drawings in my books, I think that was a big advantage, but the actual text component of these was pretty good. And that's basically the 50 best books in medicine.
There we are. There we are. Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers. I think we should change your motto to I read all the studies, I read all the books, I watch all the videos, I read all the newsletters, and peruse all the websites so that you don't have to. But and I expose the other doctors who really don't know what they're doing. Anyhow, that's fantastic. I tried to keep track of each book. I missed one here and there. I'm going to add the list of the books in the description below this video so people can see them. But that was pretty amazing. I agree with you. I mean, I realize I need to read a lot more books. How many books to reach those 50 books do you think you had to read to come?
I probably read at least 5 books for every book that I got included here. And so that's kind of what I was trying to do, is give people a shortcut to find stuff out, because it's hard. You go to, let's say you go to a used bookstore or even a regular public bookstore, you're going to find like over 90% of the nutrition books, they're not good, 99% of them. So to find something that really tells you the truth, it takes a lot of effort. So I just figured I'd make this like a roadmap, shortcut to figuring out how to be healthy. And once you got a lot of these books are sort of, landmark books in their field. You then have the foundation that you could read everything else in the field and make sense of it.
No, there's several that I'm really interested in hearing you talk about them. I've heard you allude to them in other videos that you do, but to have you describe them in detail is very helpful. So the books, the number one is Starch Solution. The top books, number two is another McDougall book, Digestive Tune-Up. Number three is your book, which I agree, John McDougall, The Doctor Who Fought for You. Then Burkett's book on cancer about fiber being the key to life, basically the Pritikin promise. No such thing as too much or too low fat in your diet. No such thing as a diet too low in fat, I should say. Kempner and the Rice Diet, the Blood Viscosity, the Sloop Book, High Blood Pressure Solution, Richard Moore, Prevent and Reverse, Esselstyn, Medical Reformation, Vegan Renaissance Bible, Multiple Sclerosis by Swank, What's Missing from Medicine. That's one I've never read. Sarah Stanek. I've never met her, but I've heard a lot about this. The China Study by Colin, Caffeine Blues, Life Without Diabetes, Roy Taylor, with an honorable mention to Robbie Barbero. Let's see what, then you mentioned several diabetes books and papers, Advanced Nutrition and Human Metabolism, Gropers, Stopping Kidney Disease, The Basics, Lee Hull, Secrets to Ultimate Weight Loss. You said Chef AJ's got the best weight loss book, Estrogeneration. Estrogeneration. Is that what it's called? Anthony J.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a
estrogen chemistry, whatever it is. How it makes you fat, sick, and infertile. Your Body in Balance, a Neil Bernard book. That's a great one about hormones and so on. Iron and Human Disease. That's your Pretorius and Kell one that I've heard you speak about many times. Buettner's Blue Zone, Soteria. That was one I hadn't heard of. Through Madness to Deliverance, a psychiatrist, and his work in curing people without drugs, which, yeah, of course, got him kicked out of the medical associations. There was one on number 24. I've got it. I didn't get it. Went by too fast. Psychological Seduction, Kirkpatrick, Brain Disabling Treatments in Psychiatry by Bregan. Drug-Induced Dementia, Jackson. That sounds quite interesting. Anatomy of an Epidemic. Of course, that's been around. Robert Whitaker. The Myth of Mental Illness, Thomas Sraz. Food Forensics, Mike Adams. Toxic Legacy about glyphosate, which that's got to be a good one. Diagnosis Mercury. Money, Politics and Poison. Unsafe at Any Meal, Renee Defoe. The Devil's Poison, a fluoride book, Dean Murphy, the dentist. Imagine You Are an Aluminum. I don't know. That one I'm going to have to look back. Brain Fables, Alberto Espe, Alzheimer's Turning Point, The Delatore, Mouse Dimension, all that one you've talked about many times. Excitotoxins, MSG, and so on. Fat, Stressed, and Sick, Catherine Reed. And I went and watched that video after you talked about it. It was absolutely fascinating. I guess she's got like a TED Talk. And you see the video of her daughter and how, you know, she's so off in her own world with autism. And by the end, when she's changed her diet, she's answering questions. She's got personality. She's laughing. It's like, wow, what a change. She's onto something. Calcium Connections, number 41, Poor Man's Way to Prevent Dementia. Another great one. That's yours. On cortisol and neurovascular uncoupling. EMFD. Really? I'll check that out. I'm not, if you think so. Mercola. Explaining Unexplained Illnesses. Martin Paul. Tripping Over the Truth. Travis Christofferson. Radical Remission, Kelly Turner. Senior Fitness, Ruth Heydrich. I was just talking to her on Sunday. Raw Can Cure Cancer, Jeanette Murray Wakeland. They've been around, the marathon a day guys. Drugs Never Cure Disease, Lorraine Day. Of course, she's huge in this segment here. Poor Man's Way to Fight Cancer, one of yours. Ischemic Spine. That sounds like a very interesting one. Dr. Rogers, thanks for another great presentation. And to everybody watching, I'm going to say thanks all of you guys, the viewers, for making it all the way to the end. Please give it a like, subscribe, share. Thank you. We'll see you on the next one.